in a moment I'll be asking these incredible people to just say something biographical about themselves, just introduce themselves. But I think, as moderator, I'd just like to gently touch on the description of the panel, which struck me as being slightly sad puppyish. Do people know who the sad puppies are? They're a bunch of right-wing science fiction fans who feel, I think they're kind of, well, they're just sort of, women are dominating. Where are the men? The men include Tade Thompson, 3-book deal with Little Brown, T.L. Huchu, 2-book deal with Tor.com, Suyi Davis about to make a major announcement. I think the men are doing okay. So I'm hoping what this panel will be is a celebration of terrific writing and books by wonderful writers who are women. And if maybe just moving from my left just across, people introduce themselves, say something they want the audience to know or about who you are and what you do.
Hi, I'm Mohale Mashiro. I was born in Soweto. I live in Cape Town. And I'm not terribly interesting, so I don't know what to share with you, but I'm the author of Intruders.
Okay, thank you. I'm Nnedi Okorafor. I write books and stuff, and comics and other things. And my book is Who Fears Death, which has been optioned by HBO to be made into a TV series.
Yeah.
I'm so excited to watch that. Yeah. My name is Temi Oh. I wrote Do You Dream of Terror 2, which came out in March. So I'm a science fiction writer. My parents are Nigerian, but I was born in London. So like a lot of my characters, I think a lot about like immigration and like living in the diaspora.
So, I mean, we could start, well, first off, I just want to say a little bit extra. Like this book, so many of the stories in this book do is they take aspects of life in current South Africa, not the future, current South Africa. And the phrase is sprung metaphors. They take things that are metaphors and then make them real. So if there's an epidemic of drug abuse, well, there really is an epidemic. And if drugs make people rigid physically or rigid mentally, then this is zombies as a metaphor for social decay showing up as drug use. The stories are contemporary. I would say they're literary, whatever that means, because the point of the stories is never, hey, we electrocuted all the zombies. The point of the story is actually, it's a story of loving friendship to the point of death, and the significance is in what happens to the characters. Obviously, if you need an introduction to Nnedi Okorafor, you should just leave. But if anybody asks me, okay, and people do, so if there's one book I should read, don't bother, it's too late, go away. If there's one book I should read about, in this area of African futurism or African non-realistic writing, I would say start with Who Fears Death. Because apart from anything else, you can spread the feel and the sounds and the life in Africa on this, on a slice of bread. It comes so thick from this book. It's alive. And it tells a wonderful, thrilling story, and is everything, I think, that a work of African futurism should do. Last, and not least, is Temi Oh. It's one of her book. Do you have a copy you can hold up? Another book that you should hopefully not leave without buying, because it's one of the most convincing, realistic descriptions of space travel I've read. The speculation in this novel is superb. They don't have nearly light speed engines. There's no time dilation. It takes 24 years to get there. The pilots have to be 17 years old. They're trained from age 13 in hyper forced schooling, which you never, you don't point, you don't explain, but we know it's tantamount to child abuse. And then one of the characters does something. The character you might even love the most does something. When I read that, I was just crying. And from then on, the psychological precision and insight into the characters being trapped in that ship for those years is just extraordinary. So great books, that's something to be said. We have an incredible range of women writers working in the field. I'm just wondering, anybody on the panel care to talk about a book by a writer in the field that's struck you?
Yeah, Nnedi Okorafor's Book of Phoenix. Book of Phoenix. Oh, why? Oh, okay. So I was preparing for Open Book, another book festival, I think it was 2 years ago, and I received this book, and the cover was very vibrant, and I was having a difficult time finishing books. So I thought, okay, I'll start with this one, and I sat in a coffee shop, and I fully intended to leave after an hour, and then I had breakfast at the coffee shop, and then I had lunch at the coffee shop, and then eventually people called me and said, like, are you okay? Because we're supposed to be meeting for supper. So I got lost in this world, and I always love, women who blow shit up, and I love that. So yeah, that's the book. I'm sorry to put you on the spot, Nnedi.
Yeah, well, I really like Nnedi Okorafor. I think I was discussing it, but I really felt a call to her, especially because I read her when I was around 14 and I was living in London, and a lot of her writing is about being a Nigerian but living in London and not really understanding about where's home. And it's sort of, some people describe it as magical realism. It's sort of defies genre, but it's so beautiful and it's really introspective and dreamlike, all of her books. And yeah, I was saying that The Icarus Girl is quite a good introduction. That's the first book that she wrote. But I find her personally such an inspiration, but also her writing is amazing, and watching her journey as she releases more books. Yeah.
For me, I think I read pretty widely, so I'm not only reading within the genre. Actually, most of what I read is outside of it. But I will say that recently, what I've read that I really enjoyed, I don't think it's out yet. It's War Girls by Tochi Onyebuchi, and that's it's not out yet. It's out in a, I don't even know, but it's set in a future where Biafra has become its own part of the world, and it's about its main character is about a girl who is part machine and part human. So it's actually quite violent, and it's quite dark, and that's the kind of thing that I really enjoy reading. But it's dark. It's dark, and it deals with war, and we're dealing with Africa and war and everything, but it's set in the future, and it's speculating in a really interesting way. Yeah.
He is, I think, a professional futurist. So yeah. It's interesting you say you're focusing on the African background there a bit. I'm just wondering if there's anything people on the panel would like to say about. Okay, in 2009, when I started getting interested in this stuff, there were a couple of responses that you would get. Africans don't write science fiction. What are you doing teaching our children about witchcraft? Africans have too many problems. We're too sensible. We have to get on with life as it is. And I kept thinking, but there are all these smartphones, and they're going to change things. There's been, obviously, an explosion first within Africa itself and on the continent itself and in the diaspora, and I think now in the wider media. What do we think, do we think there's anything special about non-realistic writing, speculative fiction, African futurism, coming from African writers?
Yeah, well, I've been thinking that like a lot when you look at like a lot of tropes of science fiction, things like alien invasions and dystopia, a lot of like our like history in the 20th and 21st century has been kind of dystopian and has involved alien invasions, and so I think there's definitely like science fiction. It's a way of reflecting our like present lives through like a different lens, and we can use science fiction to do that. So I think, yeah.
I mean, everyone has a future. So like this whole idea of science fiction not appealing to African audiences has always been ridiculous to me. I understand where that sentiment is coming from, but it's just been ridiculous to me. I don't think that. I mean, and also on top of that, you have other narratives, science fictional narratives that are well loved on the continent. You know, I mean, Star Wars and like those, they consume that and they're fine with that. So it's like I don't really think that that's really I don't want to call it realistic, but it's a weird knee-jerk reaction. Also, if you look at just general mythology and beliefs and the way people think, I don't see why speculative fiction wouldn't appeal to. As a matter of fact, the idea of science, a category for science fiction and fantasy, to me, I thought it was odd. And I'm speaking of Africa as a whole. Okay, we know that it's not a country, right? But I think that those categories are odd because even in just any African literature, you find the mystical, you know, and it's part of it's part of the worldview, and it makes sense. It's normal. So I think it's a very Western ideology to think that the mystical is so separate from the mundane and has to be something else. Like if you're writing with mystical things in it, then therefore it's something else. I think that concept is somewhat foreign. And then also in terms of alien invasions, I mean, and I've said this before, I read Things Fall Apart as an alien invasion. You know, it makes sense. I mean, you think about colonialism, you think about others and foreigners who have come in and invaded and all that. I mean, the idea of alien invasions is you know, it's not anything new. So science fiction and fantasy, to me, I don't see why it would be something that is odd or something that is new. I think it's already very in the. I can stop talking, but I can keep going. I mean, this is what I write, and it just. I don't really see why it's odd. I think it's natural.
And you did win the Shoyinka Prize in 2008 for Zara the Windseeker. Mm-hmm. One of the things that, as a Westerner, strikes me immediately is that there really isn't, when you're talking about publishing within Africa, and why I personally want to see a lot more publishing in Africa, by Africans, for Africans, is that there isn't this thing about genre. You know, to keep up with science fiction, fantasy, non-realistic writing in Africa, you've got to read all the journals. Because if you want it just genreized into one journal, there's really basically only Omanana. You know, there isn't this artificial division, I think artificial division between literature, thriller.
I was going to say I agree with Nnedi. I mean, I grew up with my mom telling me this story. It's a really horrific story, though. It's about a girl whose mom goes off to the fields, and her mom says, you know, there's a giant cannibal around. So, you know, don't let anyone in. I'll bring you food at lunch, but don't let anyone in unless it's me, and you'll know it's me because I'll sing a certain song. And of course the cannibal overhears this, and he goes to do some muti juju there. I think he swallows like a hot iron or something to make his voice finer. And of course he captures Zilani, and there are many different endings to the story. So for me, spec-fic is not very far away from what I grew up on. And it's just this weird thing that's like, oh yes, the Africans are finally doing it. It's weird.
Somebody said we have always written science fiction. Just now to maybe shift to what maybe the panel was supposed to be about, do we think that the writing of non-realistic fiction has anything special to say or to come out from women authors? Is there anything in science fiction we've just had a remarkably, reason we're also late, a remarkable revolutionary talk by Mona. And it really was a very hard-hitting, revolutionary talk about a major change in culture across the board in terms of patriarchy and women. Do we think that science fiction has anything to contribute to that or to comment on that?
Well, first, I'm not a woman author. I'm just an author. So I don't know really how to answer that, because I don't know. I feel like we're just doing what we want to do, and there weren't many of us before, and we're kind of just breaking in, really. And that's the sentiment of intruders. It's people who are often told, you don't belong here, and they suddenly go, oh, actually I do, thank you very much. So I don't know what to say about that, because I'm a writer, not a woman writer, I don't know what to say.
Yeah, I mean, it's not like we're sitting and as we're writing, we're thinking, oh, I'm a woman, okay, let me just see how I can do things because I'm a woman. I don't think about that. Like when I'm writing, and mind you, I do write powerful female characters. Like almost all of my main characters are powerful, complex, flawed female characters who drive the plot. They're not passive. And they are destructive, and they do blow shit up, and that's what they do. But like when I'm writing, I'm not thinking that, okay, I need to make a point here. It's that the point comes through. So I think that the fact that we're writing is really it. And okay, so this panel, almost asking the title of this panel, almost asking that question of why are female writers so successful in speculative fiction. First of all, there aren't that many of us yet, so it's like it's a strange question to ask when we're just starting, as if, I mean, would this be asked if there were mostly male authors who were coming in, and I mean, with this question, it would be, why are there so many? Yeah, I mean, when there are like 10 major male authors, male African authors who are coming in, I don't think that would be the case, and so like I think it's too early to really ask the question of what are women doing, like what do women have to contribute to this, because we're just slowly breaking in terms of and I'm just talking about in terms of publishing, though the stories have always been there. Science fiction, as far as African science fiction, it's always been there. In terms of fantasy, speculative fiction, it's always been there. But publishing is a different story. So I think that, like, at this point, just let it ride. That's at least that's the way I see it. It's not something that I don't think about my femaleness when I'm writing stories.
No, I would say that maybe not in like specifically African speculative fiction, but definitely in science fiction, and especially like with my book and books about space, my initial impression growing up with books about space was that they were quite male. And the books that I love, like Solaris and Kim Stanley Robinson's books, are really quite male, and often the characters sort of feel like pawns to like move the plot along, or embodiments of an idea to like advance an argument. So I think I was thinking about what I feel like I need when I come to writing, and I'm interested in relationships. I'm interested in I'm partly interested in like the propulsion system of an engine, but I'm also interested in like, how does it feel being in space? How does it feel being separated from your family? So I made it was sort of an active decision in my book to really focus sort of internally and kind of aim for a kind of psychological realism that I definitely felt like I was missing. A lot less so now, and I have noticed that more of the books that like I feel satisfied by sort of emotionally, things like Emma Newman, she writes a lot about space and relationships, and Mallory Blackman had a book called Chasing the Stars, which was about relationships in space. And I've noticed that the ones that I do enjoy have coincidentally been by women. So I feel like maybe there is something unique that we do sort of are contributing to the genre at the moment. Yeah.
Diaspora. I mean, diaspora is a very important theme as well, moving of populations. Do you think that fiction coming from Africa and from the diaspora has anything specific that you can deal with in science fiction terms?
I've really related to your book, Binti, and about how, because it was about leaving home and being around people who are different from you and don't understand you and don't understand where you come from, and that sort of alienation. I think that that feeling of isolation and alienation is definitely something that can help. You can express in a really moving way through science fiction and speculative fiction.
Well, I think for me, it's very difficult to find this weird kind of experiment that was or is South Africa. I keep thinking South Africa's dead. This weird experiment that is South Africa, and when I wrote Intruders, I was really, really upset with South Africa. The country had really, really broken my heart, and I didn't know how to deal with it. I mean, I probably should have gone to therapy, but I didn't know how to deal with it. So I started writing these stories, based on all of these kind of tropes. It's zombies, not, it's like a zombie outbreak. It's a virus, whatever. But really talking about substance abuse in South Africa, and two sisters who are ghost hunters, that kind of thing. So for me, it was. When I think about the genre and I look at South Africa, I'm like, wow, no, I wasn't too far off, hey? This is actually realism in many ways. So I think for me, it helped me deal with South Africa's weird issues.
Yeah, I think in terms of diaspora, I think about my series, the Akata books, that lovely title. I love saying it, the Akata books. And that series is really all about, not all about, but a large part of it, because I'm kind of working on part 3 right now, so it's very much in my mind. It's very much about just that line between Nigeria and the United States. It's like the main character, Sunny, is Nigerian American, and I'm exploring a lot of ideas, but it's on multiple layers, because when I first started writing the first Akata Witch, I was thinking a lot about mysticism, in particular Igbo cosmology and spiritual beliefs, and about colonialism, decolonized. And my Nigerian Americanness, because whenever I would visit home, especially in Imo State, I'd ask a lot of questions. I'd ask a lot of questions about, spiritual beliefs and different things that I'd hear about, because I was always listening and I'd hear things, and I'd always get shut down. I'd always hear, don't ask about that. 1, you're female, you should know about that. 2, we don't talk about those things because they're evil, and that you should be saved. I have an uncle who would always try to save me whenever I start asking questions. So I got more curious about these things, and the first Akata book was really born out of that. I wanted to explore those things, and once I started writing fiction, I felt like I had the agency to explore those things that I was forbidden from talking about. And I think a lot of it had to do with the fact that me being Nigerian American, I had a certain distance from these things that a lot of people would have seen as terrifying and dangerous, and that I shouldn't write about them. But me, I was really curious about them, and I kind of leaned into that. And so I started exploring that. And so that's what I mean by multiple levels, where I'm looking at this culture that I was born into, that's part of me, but I'm outside of it at the same time, and I'm exploring that. So our main character is part of multiple worlds. She's Nigerian American, and she ends up exploring all these different aspects of traditional spiritualities and all of that in a way that's very, very almost aggressive. Where there's no fear, where it's become something that's good, evil, neutral, many different things. And so I think that that diaspora side of me, that part of me, is very much something that gave birth to the Akata books.
I mean, I can remember as a young gay guy reading Samuel Delaney's I and Gomorrah, and it was the first piece of queer fiction I'd ever run across, and it just was immensely important. I think it made me a writer, because it meant that I could write about something that really meant something to me. And I think that's kind of the reading experience and writing experience we want to give to people, really. And that's what science fiction can do, because it wasn't a story about being gay, it was a story about being sexually different, a new kind of gender created by the future. And I think, imagining futures and different futures. Everyone has a future, everyone has a story. Okay. Oh dear, another elephant in the room. Mohali, you wrote a really interesting, measured introduction to Intruders, and there is a sense that science fiction and fantasy might do something different within the African context than maybe in other contexts. Do you want to talk about that?
So I wrote this essay when I finished Intruders, because I was sending the manuscript, and then it suddenly hit me that somebody's going to call it Afrofuturism. And I was terrified. So I told my publisher and the editor, I said to them, ignore that email. Something else is coming. I just need time to figure it out. And I wrote this essay, Afrofuturism, Ayashi Samadegi. And really it's just about, and then I went and looked, like, what is Afrofuturism and who coined it, like, what's up? And when I read, it's in a book called Black to the Future, I think, or it's an essay called Black to the Future, I can't remember now. But, so I read this thing and I thought, oh, that's really interesting, it makes sense, but it just doesn't, it's not for me, And so I started writing this essay, and I was like, oh, I don't know if this is going to make me unpopular, because, Afrofuturism is the new buzzword. But I think, and I said this yesterday, not everything is for everyone except money, so that's fine, And I read a lot of Afrofuturism, so it's not like I hate it. I was like, oh goodness, please don't slap that label on here. And really, my opinion is that Afrofuturism is not for Africans living in Africa. Buy the book and read the essay. But yeah, no, that's just how I felt, and I was horrified that somebody would slap that label on Intruders, which is why I wrote that essay, and I wrote it quickly, and I sent it, and I was like, hey, this has to be in the book so people don't mistake me for Afrofuturism. But Nnedi, you came up with something an alternative.
I understand your fear of being slapped with the label, because I've been slapped left and right with it for like how many years. It's been interesting watching the development of the term, and the original definition labels a lot of things as I want to say African American science fiction, but it's a lot more than that. It's a lot more than that sometimes, depending on who you're talking to. But the original definition, the one thing that the original definition was very clear on was that it was speaking about African Americans. Okay, so over the years, other scholars have opened it up and said it was more than that. I still don't agree. And I was born and raised in the United States, and I write stories that are basically rooted in various parts of Africa. And I don't relate to that label either. Now the thing is, the moment I said that I didn't relate to that label, it was ugly. It was ugly. I think that was it was either the first or second time I was dragged on Twitter, and it was nasty. It was horrible, and I understood where the sentiment was coming from, but really what I was being accused of when I said that I didn't consider myself an Afrofuturist, because basically, I feel like someone's going to tweet what I'm saying, so.
Everyone switch your phones off.
This is a safe space.
No, that's
That's why I hesitate. Yeah. Oh, it is, because, yeah, I mean, I really don't want to leave here and then have just a whole bunch of chaos going on Twitter. It's not fun. But I was accused of, and I still am accused of hating African Americans. I'm not considered African American because both of my parents are Nigerian, and I'm fine with that. I understand that demarcation. That's been told to me before, but because I don't identify as an Afrofuturist does not equal me hating African Americans. That's really bizarre. And me embracing my heritage does not mean I hate African Americans either, but some people interpret it that way. So yeah, the alternative that I came up with, even though I still am labeled left and right as an Afrofuturist, I'm clumped in there, and because of that, I'm read in a way that I don't think is accurate, and that was why I had to come up with an alternative and kind of adhere to that. The alternative is I call myself an African futurist. One word, and God, I just wrote an essay on it. Because I'm going to say read the essay because it took me a long time to put that together very carefully. And if I say anything that deviates from it, someone will be like, "Well, you said this though, that you're contradicting, blah blah blah," and then I'm just like, ah. So yeah, I recently, and for a while, I didn't put out the definition of it because I knew that if I put out the definition at that time, I would have been dragged again, and my words would have been taken the wrong way. But it really says that. What I'm writing, the science fiction that I am writing, I consider African futurism science fiction. Fantasy is not included in it, but it's rooted in African culture, dialogue. It's interested in the future. I haven't memorized what I wrote, but that's part of it. It's interested in the future, but it's also interested in the present. It acknowledges the present. It acknowledges the fact that the present exists, and then where do we go from there? And it's not imagining something that I don't know. It's not imagining what could have been.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
My pleasure. It took me a while to get there.
Thank you for being brave enough to speak. Thank you.
I definitely wonder about this term since I don't think anyone's ever referred to me as Afrofuturism.
Give it time.
Exactly. Yeah. Really?
I don't know. I want to be part of this club. Yeah. But I also wonder how big it is in the UK because even Taddy Thompson, the only people I've heard describe him as Afrofuturists are Americans, not really people in the UK. So
I'll say one more thing. I have to say this. There's something that happens, and I feel like it's a very American thing, where there's a need to set the default as American, that those stories are the most important, and those stories are the ones that need to be told, and everything that is told other than that has to come from that, has to speak through that voice, and I think that's highly problematic, and I'm going to shut up now. That's all I'll say. I think that's highly problematic, and I think we need to think about that.
I agree with what you're saying because I was actually, I talk about this a lot. People ask me about it a lot now as well. And there was an American woman in the audience, and she waited for me outside, and she said, "I don't agree with you." Because I don't know what about, but okay. And she said, it can be, your stuff can be called Afrofuturism. There's nothing wrong with it. So I said, I didn't say there was anything wrong with it, but perhaps I would like my stuff to have a different name. And I'm not saying I don't enjoy Afrofuturism. I read it. It's just not what I'm doing. So there is that kind of tendency to be like, well, we have a term for it, so get in line and make your own little subdivision.
Yeah, I think this is the thing though, because people, they try to call you these names because they're proud of you and they want to claim you. I felt personally hurt when Margaret Atwood kept emphatically saying she's not writing science fiction when she's writing, it's got a lot of science in it and it's fantastical, and I don't know, people who write science fiction are proud to be associated with her, and I think sometimes denouncing it, it's hard not to take it personally because it's not just intellectual, it's sort of personal, and they're like, we want to be associated with you because we're proud of you,
Yeah, but just because you like something doesn't mean that thing you have to be that thing. You know, it's okay. You can enjoy something that is outside of yourself. And I think that's a really necessary, it's a necessary practice, because I think that need to relate, and in order to relate, it has to be, I mean, that way of thinking leads to all kinds of things. One way is that if you're writing I'm just going to use a hypothetical here, but I know people who this has happened to. If you're writing a story that is set in Africa and it's all about Africans and there are only black people in the story, they might ask you, well, can you put a white person in there so that white audiences can relate? You know, that's what that whole, like, the only way you
like
can relate
black
is
person
to...
in The Great Gatsby,
Yeah.
so I could relate.
Well, I mean, if that's the way you want to, if that's the only way you can relate is to inject yourself into a story where it's not natural. Yeah, I know, I'm just saying. I just want to make sure my point lands. It's very, very important.
One of the things that strikes me is kind of distinctive. Wally Talabi does this marvelous database of just about everything he can find that's published. Hasn't been able to do it lately because he has like the world's most demanding job. But in 1 year, there was 800 short stories that were in this broad category published. And we went through them, and I would say that fully 2/3 of them, at least, of the 800 stories, were dealing with what I would call traditional beliefs. Stuff that was embedded in deep culture. And actually, you know, there's very few parts of the world where the deep culture is still accessible, is still living, is still followed by people. And in that context, Jennifer McCumbee just said, you know, in Africa, magic is realism.
Yeah.
And
right.
I kind of feel I don't like the term magic realism because it seems to me to be tremendously disrespectful of living beliefs.
Yeah.
You wouldn't call a story about Jesus Christ magic realism.
Maybe we should.
So does anybody want to say anything about the relationship to deep culture?
Yeah, I definitely say, that I agree with that. I remember, like, in my own family, when my parents, like, they're Christians, and they were talking about, there was a debate about where someone in our family should be buried, and they were like, oh, well, it'll all be fine once we dig the grave. And I was like, why? And they were like, well, you can't dig another grave. And I was like, why? And they were like, because someone has to go in it. like it's almost as true as the laws of nature. You dig 2 graves, someone else will die. Yeah.
Jim just wow. Well, I think it's, you know, the reason why maybe writers like us seem like an anomaly is because, well, nobody was writing about us. And so for me, it's very important to put in even urban legends. There's an urban legend about a very beautiful woman called Vera, although in South Africa, Vera. So a story about Vera, and what she does is she's on the side of the road hitchhiking, and everybody's got, this kind of story, this kind of urban legend or whatever, but she gets into a car with a man, whoever, she's a hitchhiker, and this man picks her up, and then she's like, want to go back to my place or whatever, and then he wakes up in a graveyard. And I think it's like her tombstone or something, and one of the other endings is that she sits in the back seat, and then the driver of the car, and it's always a man. I'm just saying, it's always a man. The driver of the car ends up in a fatal car accident, and I really wanted to write about Vera, and so I did. These 2 ghost hunting sisters from Durban, and they're in Bloemfontein hunting a Vera of that neighborhood. It's nice to put the urban legends in there, or at least our versions of, that kind of story. I'm sure everybody has that kind of story, something similar.
I mean, once there's I'm going to screw up his name, Cedric Jan Agbolo, who's a francophone science fiction writer. I'd be better if he was publishing in English. But his, sorry, I'm sorry I've offended somebody now. I did my best. I'm usually pretty good on names, but I don't know Cedric terribly well, and I haven't heard him pronounce his name. But one of his definitions of African futurism is that the traditional beliefs are envisaged as continuing into the future, surviving into the future, and being validated, as shown as being working.
Yeah, that's something that I've been very interested in, like just this idea of it's not just the traditional beliefs, but the deities and the gods, wanting to see them in the future. Like when I'm writing science fiction, the first thing that I thought of was, I don't know, and in the past when I've read science fiction, for me, I didn't grow up reading a lot of it for the same reason. I think you were saying that you found it very white male, sterile, cold. I'd always found it that way. And so the way that I came to writing science fiction were just seeing, especially cell phones showing up in Nigeria whenever I would come and visit with my relatives, and we go to really remote parts in Imo State to just visit with relatives. Their cell phones started popping up, and I started thinking about how, what the future would be like if, when you have all of this technology just showing up, especially in the really rural parts, where they've kind of bypassed infrastructure, and what would the future look like? And so immediately when I started imagining the future especially those areas, because it wasn't so much the cities and the modern places that I was interested in. I was always interested in rural places. And so the first thing I thought of were the deities and the gods, and I thought about like where would they manifest? How would they manifest? What would juju be like in the future? And I wanted to see that, and that was really important to me. That was really important because a lot of times modernization, the definition of modernization is westernization, and so this idea that we're wiping away all those cultural traditional aspects. I never liked that. So it was really important for me to one, look into the future, but also to bring all of that with and see what that would be like. And in doing so, realizing that it was all very possible. In terms of challenges, that's part of the writing. So it's I don't really see I don't see challenges when I'm writing. When I'm looking into the future, I do see it's part of the process. And when you're looking, well, for me, when I'm writing science fiction, one, I'm not thinking about writing science fiction when I'm writing science fiction. I tend to happen to be writing it, and then I look back and I call it science fiction. But when I'm writing something that, let's say it's set in the future, it's I have written things that are in futuristic places that are made up. I have written those, but most of the things that I write are in real places. So there have to be connections to the past and the present. And I'm very much about being as accurate as possible. So I don't see it as a difficulty, though. I enjoy it. Looking at how certain technologies, for example, like if you're setting something, for me, if I'm setting something in the desert, in a desert region, I'd look at the people. I get very specific. If it's set in a town, I would have to research that town. I'd research those people, research what their movements are like to see what that area would be like in the near future or the far future or whatever. I'd look at technology, I'd look at weather change, I'd look at climate change, I'd look at all sorts of. I'm very much about the details because I enjoy that. I enjoy that part of it. I guess you could say one difficulty about writing about the future is climate change because we're not heading in a very good direction right now. So I like to have positive. I'm not so interested in dystopias anymore. I've written a lot of dystopias, but I'm not so interested in writing sad, destroyed, dark, apocalyptic kind of narratives. I'm kind of bored with that. So finding how can the future be a positive place with the way that we're going is definitely a big challenge because we're already reaching a point of no return. I think 2020 is the point of no return if we don't make some changes. So that's one of the biggest things.
Yeah, that's true. Actually, it's about how bad is it going to get in the future. I actually have a story about actually like the sun falling, or like, you know, the fire coming from the sky, and then these people have to, you know, go live in space. And for me, one of my biggest things was, in the race for space, what does race mean in space? And that was one of the big things, because, you know, Elon Musk is doing a lot, you know, and it's always guys like Elon Musk, and I think, well, what the heck is going to happen to people that look like me? So it's a fun opportunity actually to, because it's all fiction, right? You are making stuff up, and it's fun because then you can't be like, oh, we don't have this speed of internet yet, so I can't write it into the story. So for me, the challenge is actually not getting carried away sometimes. Yeah.
I'd definitely say, yeah, that's not really a challenge, that's the joy, and it's partly like why I chose this genre. It's really joyful to try and imagine different futures, and also it's like quite a political thing to decide the future, to decide like what countries have power and why, and you know, what are the overarching philosophies, and having the power to do that just on my own is also like one of the things that I find really joyful.
There's a Ghanaian writer called Jonathan Doche, and Jonathan founded a blog back in 2010 called Afro Cyberpunk to deal with these kinds of things. And his experience is that he started writing a novel, an American future with African characters, and said, nope, it's got to be set in Africa. And his experience is that, especially in 2011, 2012, just setting a science fiction novel in an African future was amazingly, you know, every time there's a political, that you have to decide what kind of African political future you're going to have, how the technology is going to develop, and there hasn't been enough people doing it. And science fiction is actually kind of a genre where people build on each other's futures. So there's this blank slate that people in this field, it's a joy and it's an opportunity, but there's an awful lot of extra work.
Yeah, it's definitely interesting to notice like what causes like different sort of movements in science fiction. Like there was a big boom of like fiction about Mars, and now that isn't really happening. And then there was like a lot in the sort of like late 90s, 2000s about like genetic engineering, and now it seems to be like AI and robotics, and so science definitely like informs the fiction. And,
Any other questions?
My question goes to all three of you, and it's mainly about technique. I'm just curious, individually, how you approach your writing, you know, being science fiction or African futurism or Afrofuturism. Do you start out by creating, you know, you build the world first, or it's a story Bible, and you layer on the situations and the characters later on? If the question makes any sense. You know, it's just generally how you approach it.
Yeah, I'm interested too, Nnedi. I want to know. Also, I want to know how you manage to be so prolific.
I write a lot.
She stays off Twitter.
Yeah, I'm never on Twitter. I don't do anything there. Actually, I've worked Twitter into my writing process. So I'll like type and work on the few pages and stop and go and make some trouble over there and then leave and then go back to writing. Yeah, I don't get distracted with that. But I'll start. The way that I come up with stories is I'm very much a pantser, which is, you know, fly by the seat of your pants. I don't outline. I don't work. It typically starts off with character. I'm one of those writers who hears the characters' voices. I hear voices, yes, talking to me, and my characters talk to me. And that's how it starts. And then I don't think I've ever done a world Bible, ever. Like, I don't think I've ever done one. And I think that I have the world in my head, though. Like I can, it's so vivid in my mind that I can go in there, like Binti's world, for example, I can go into her world and look around and see all the details. I can see a shop over here. I can see, you know, this object that one of the characters was building and what school he went to. Like I know all the details, and I hold that in my mind when I'm writing, and then I write through the character as if I'm there. So it's like I don't have to refer to anything. And the difficulty with that is that it's a lot to hold in your mind. And if time goes by, you have to kind of revisit. But I don't have much of a problem with that. But I think that I spend a lot of time thinking about the worlds, especially the science fictional aspects of them, and kind of putting it all together. And so by the time I start writing, it's very vivid and clear, and I write as if I know, as if I've been there, and it's pretty clear.
Same.
Wow, good.
No, it's the characters. It's definitely the characters. I mean, that other wonderful stuff that happens, it's the characters are experiencing that stuff. It's not that stuff happening to characters for me. So I do focus mainly on what they're going through, and it is in my mind for a long time before I sit down. And once I sit down, then me and the words will figure it out.
See, I feel like I'm the opposite of both of you because I'm a total planner. Yeah, I think I begin coming up with a story. I sort of begin with a question. So with this one, I was thinking about this other Earth, and it takes 23 years to get there. And then I was thinking, you're never coming home. Why would you leave home? So then I think about the characters, but I sort of thought about them I'd give them a reason, then I'd give them a background to answer the question, if that makes sense. I have one of them, her dad's a missionary, so she has this past of leaving home. But then I plan each of the scenes. I really focus on pacing. I maybe have a page, maybe 2 pages of plans for every sort of chapter or scene.
Do you stick to it?
Well, sometimes I'll sort of realize that it's going in the wrong direction, but every time I do, I'll step back, replan, and then write. I basically never write just from a blank page.
Wow.
Yeah. And I'm also really I sort of approach editing like problem solving. I'll kind of think, well, okay, so this character seems really not very likable, and then I'll look at other books and think, what makes characters likable? Okay, if they're sympathetic, if they're competent, how can I show those things? Yeah, so I really sort of left brain about it. Yeah.
Is there?
Hi, this question is for Nnedi. Some Nigerian children's stories we were told as kids seem to quell curiosity and adventure. Children will be told not to do some certain things without being told why. And fear was like a kind of big tool that was used to restrict children. Like that story Muhali told about the child who was told not to open the door. I realized that she's not Nigerian, but that story is also told here, but it's not quite the same. But it's the same idea generally. So Nnedi, I could see that in Zara the Ringseeker, it was kind of different from those sort of stories. So is that idea of stifling curiosity something that you try to break in your life?
Can you repeat the last part? Because I can't quite hear you.
Okay, the idea of stifling curiosity in children, is that something you try to break in your writing?
The idea of stifling curiosity in children, is that something that I want to break, or
like something that you're not quite okay with, so you
yeah.
want to turn the...
Yeah. Okay. Got it. Yeah. Yeah. Very much so. I think in almost all of my books for children and adults, this idea of stifling curiosity is definitely something that I write against. I think that, for me growing up, I think my parents were very much about letting my siblings and I kind of explore what we were interested in. There's always that whole push towards, there are only 4 careers: doctor, engineer, lawyer, and failure. It's a failure. So yeah, that was definitely there. But my parents always let us read whatever we wanted to read, and so for me, that was how I ended up reading Stephen King at the age of 12. I read It at the age of 12. I regret that, but I enjoyed it too. I loved it. It was a big deal. It's a big deal. But I didn't pay attention to categories, and so I read whatever story interested me, and because of that, my interest my interest in reading was bolstered, and so like that love of reading eventually led to me being able, because I think that reading is very necessary to excelling in school. Like if you don't have that thing that allows you to sit down and read for long periods of time, if you don't exercise that muscle at a young age and early on, school is going to be a lot more difficult. So my parents allowing us to read whatever we wanted to read, even if it was Stephen King, allowed me to exercise that muscle enough to eventually earn 2 masters and a PhD, and then doing all this other stuff. But that does deserve applause. It's a lot of school. But yeah, so that theme of not stifling curiosity, I think that it's really important, especially in children, because curiosity leads you to so much, and when you're not curious, everything else is stifled. It's not just your creativity, but everything is stifled. So yeah, Zara the Windseeker was very much about that. Almost all of my young adult literature has that theme running very strong through it.
I think it's 4th row from the back, 3rd row in, person in the black shirt has an arm raised. Can we get them the mic?
Hi, my question is for Nnedi. I want to ask if you, as an Igbo writer, do you first of all identify as an Igbo person / writer?
Yes. Okay. Next.
Okay. And all right, great.
Duh.
So
what else would I be?
Chinua Achebe said something in one of his essays on Igbo art, and he was saying how the purpose of Igbo art is to translate some kind of spiritual understanding, right, into an aesthetically, and physically satisfying form. And as well, so I guess I want to ask, in your research, in coming up with all your work, especially the stuff that's based on cosmology, how transformative has that been for you personally? Like, how much has your belief, shifted?
Yeah. Okay. All right. That's a good question. The Igbo cosmology and beliefs are very much my own. Like, that's really the foundation of my own spiritual beliefs. And it was through me being Nigerian American, I had to find it. I had to actively go out and find it. And it was not something that was presented to me with ease in my family, because most of my family Catholic, Christian. And so I had to be curious enough to go out and find it. There are many layers that I had to be curious about first, being Nigerian American, because you could easily be born and raised in the United States and never return to Nigeria. That you can easily do that and just become American and leave that completely behind. So there's that layer. Then there's a layer of when you finally get here, people telling you shouldn't even ask about that. You don't, or people not knowing anything about that. So once you get past that layer, then you have to ask the right questions. And so I went through all of that, and yeah, my beliefs very much reflect. I don't really follow any religion per se, but my spiritual beliefs are definitely reflected as Igbo.
I'm sorry folks, we just had the Time's Up sign. So we really just have to say thank you to Ake, and thank you to our incredibly talented panelists.